For those who want to save their life will lose it. And those who lose their life for my sake will find it. So we're with Peter again. We had a few weeks here with Peter. And it's always an interesting ride with Peter because there's a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And this week, well, let me go back to last week. Last week was a big moment. That was a red letter day for Peter because he had that superhuman revelation from God when he pronounced that Jesus was the Son of God, the Son of the living God, the Christ. And so Jesus gave him this sort of superhuman privilege by saying, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not stand against it, and saying what you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and what you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And that's a big deal. That doesn't happen to you every day. So Peter is flying high, right? And maybe he's flying a little too high because now in today's gospel story, he kind of takes that privilege for a ride and he takes Jesus' side, right? And he tells Jesus that he's wrong, that what he just said is going to happen to him is not going to happen. And Jesus, you can see there, he reacts a little bit sharply. Get behind me, Satan. That's rough. So Peter goes from the high highs to the low lows. And what's really interesting in parallel about these two readings from last Sunday and from this Sunday is that in both cases, Jesus points out that Peter has these two sources of information available to him. And in the first reading, last week, he's chosen one, and this week he's chosen the other, because we see Jesus saying to him that you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. It's like the exact reverse of what he said to Peter last week. Do you remember that? He said, you were not shown this by humans, by man. You were shown this by God. So hopefully Peter is starting to learn this lesson to say, oh, okay, when I listen to God, when I set my mind on divine things, then I get a gold star from Jesus. And when I set my mind on human things, I get called Satan. So that's kind of a clear choice. But it's whether is he listening to the peace of God, the wisdom of God, the love of God, or is he listening to that sort of human anxiety? And I think that's where this is coming from when Peter is rebuking Jesus. It's from this place of anxiety. Anxiety is talking to him. Anxiety talks to me sometimes, maybe to you too. And it'll say things like, well, good things only happen to good people, and bad things only happen to bad people. And I don't know anybody gooder than Jesus. Who is more deserving of good things happening to him than Jesus? I mean, he's the Christ, the Son of the living God. We just established that. So when he starts talking about, I'm going to be persecuted and I'm going to be killed, Peter is like, you are completely blowing my worldview apart here. And so you see very well what happens. So in order to kind of deal with this contradiction that here's the worst possible thing happening to the best possible person, Jesus piles on a little bit and he throws another contradiction at him by saying, those who want to lose their life will save it. Because we see that's what Peter's trying to do, right? He's trying to preserve Jesus' life. He's trying to protect him. Because he thinks that it is Jesus' longevity, it is Jesus continuing to exist that's going to solve all their problems. It's going to liberate them from Rome, that's going to elevate him and his fellow disciples to some status that they're all seeking. They all want to be on the right side of history, don't they? And if Jesus dies, how is that going to work? But Jesus is kind of addressing this fallacy of Peter's thinking that I fall victim to quite a bit. Maybe you do too. That the point of Jesus' life is to keep living. You might have noticed on the front of the bulletin, unexplained little mosaic of historic figures. You guys know who those are? You recognize them? Who? All of them? All but one. Okay, tell me the ones you recognize, and then we'll fill in the blanks.
Princess Di, Amelia, and Charlie Parker, and I think that's Mozart.
So you got them all? Yeah. Points for Misty. Free coffee after the service. All right. And do we know what they have in common? They all died in their 30s. Anywhere from 32 to 39. Although Amelia Earhart, we don't know for sure. She disappeared. She disappeared in her 30s, presumed dead. But these lives have all been interrupted before the time that we imagined that they should, especially with truly gifted people, like all of them are in their own unique ways. We imagine we need more of that. We need more years from these people in order to get what we want from them or what we need from them, but their lives were interrupted. But were these failed lives? I wouldn't say they're failed lives at all. And it sort of challenges our fallacy that when we think about the point of this life is to keep on living, and of course Jesus, you could add him to that list. Difference is he rose again. But in the mind of his disciples, that life was cut short, and Peter wanted to preserve this and say, we need to keep this going so that we can get where we need to go. But Jesus is pushing back against that, saying, look, the point of my life is not simply to keep living. I'm not married to my wife simply to stay married. We are St. Michael's is not a church simply to stay a church. And so when you try to save your life, when you try to save a church, you try to save a marriage, or you try to save a job, we find ourselves doing this all the time to say, well, I'll do whatever it takes in order to not let this thing die, to not let this thing end. But you could spend your whole life, say your goal is to live 100 years, but if you spend half your time trying to make sure you live 100 years, guess what? You only live 50 years. How much of that time do you really spend living? My family and I found ourselves on the streetcar a few months ago as a little outing. And when we took the streetcar to go get ice cream, and when we were done, we got back on the streetcar to come home, and we found ourselves in a car with an entire wedding party. Which we thought was really cool. And the bride and the groom were very charming people, and the bride especially was interested in us, and we were having conversation, and you've met my kids. They were talking up a storm. And so they asked Christina and me about ourselves, and we said, oh, well, we've been married almost 20 years at that point. And so the bride and groom were like, 20 years? What's your secret, right? Tell us how you did it. Well, in the moment, I wasn't prepared for this. I didn't have an answer ready, so the only thing, unfortunately, that could come to my mind was a joke. And I created a hush for a moment. Oh, here's the secret right here. And everybody stopped and listened. I said, don't get divorced. And it's not even a good joke. But everybody laughed because, one, it wasn't what they expected me to say. And two, because it missed the point altogether. You could be married 20 or 50 or 70 years, and it's not necessarily that impressive. All you have to do is two things: don't die and don't get divorced. You don't deserve a medal for that, Just the longevity of on its own is not special. It's how you spent that time. What did you accomplish? What kind of a marriage did you have, whether it was for 1 year or 10 or 20 or 70? And that's the point that Jesus is trying to get through to Peter. Those who bend over backwards simply to save their lives will lose them. But there's a flip side to that. What is the upside? And that is those who lose their lives for whose sake? It says, for my sake, for Jesus' sake. that's where you find life. And Jesus has this refrain over and over throughout the Gospels. Here is where you find life, and life more abundantly. Forget about that fear that you have of interruptions, that anxiety that keeps talking to you and saying, no, this can't happen, no, that can't happen. This is what fits. This is what works in my life. And I was a victim of that. I was a perpetrator of that too. Because we talk about marriages and lives and churches and jobs. You may recall last week I was talking about how my job at the cathedral ended. And I didn't really talk about how it ended. It doesn't matter that much. But the point being, it wasn't who I was. I probably could have done, and I did stew over some things after that job ended, like what might I have nudged? What might I have changed about myself to be a better fit for that job? And I probably could have changed some things about myself and worked there another year or another 10 years. But at what cost? To be 10 more years in a place that doesn't fit. I have nothing but good things to say about the cathedral. That's where I learned to be a priest. And I made so many friends, and I still love that place. But it wasn't a good fit. And sometimes it takes a good fit to see what a bad fit really is. But we rail against those interruptions. Peter did not want to see it happen. I didn't want to see a transition in my life. And when those things start to come, we say, no, this isn't happening, this isn't happening, this isn't happening. And then we miss it. We miss the point. And I'll just close with one more little personal story. In case you were wondering why Christina and Asher and Anya were here last week and they're not here this week, they had a great time last week, and I want to thank you all again for being so hospitable and welcoming to them, and they enjoyed it, and they felt like they'd probably enjoy it even if there wasn't a luau involved. So they were planning to come today. But yesterday, we went to the pool, and you noticed how physical my kids are, maybe especially my son. He is very physical. And so we were at the pool a couple of hours, and I was on one edge of the pool, and Asher was standing at the other edge, and he said, hey, look, I'm going to do a backflip. This is a hold my beer moment, right? Not in this case. Hold my root beer. And I'm like, I've never seen him try an actual backflip. I assume he means he's just going to turn around and fall back into the pool, right? But he's standing there on the edge, and he jumps up and he does this whole complete flip, at least a 180 flip, right? And he goes into the pool, but not without hitting his head on the edge first. And there's this collective gasp, all the 20-somethings with their seltzers set them down, and they start to rush toward and say, like, oh no, what's happening? And so, but I get to him first, and I pull him up out of the pool, and his hair is red. So we get a towel. That's the best thing we have to kind of, stem the bleeding a little bit, and we get a look at it, and he's got a slice on the top of his head about 2 or 3 inches long, and it's big. So, long story short, I mean, we take him to the ER. The bleeding stops actually much quicker than I expected, and within short order, he's got 9 staples in his head. So. So that was an interesting experience. And he's doing fine this morning, but we're like, okay, that's enough excitement for one weekend for him, and so they're taking it easy at home. But my point of telling you the story is that in that moment, where we're just having a nice time enjoying ourselves at the pool, and then all of a sudden the picture changes, and there's blood. And there's something inside me that's saying, this isn't happening, this isn't happening, this isn't happening. We don't need to gather our stuff up and go to the ER. No, we don't need to call 911 or an ambulance or any of this stuff. It's going to be fine. This isn't happening. This isn't happening. There's that denial. And there's that failure to embrace reality that I see in Peter. There is a desire to preserve life, to preserve the situation. No, we're okay. We'll just, it's going to be fine. Fortunately, after a moment or two, I came around and we did get our stuff and go, like I said. But I think some of us deal with anxiety more than others. But I think it's important for us to recognize in our humanity, we all have that. We all have a preconceived notion of what sort of things ought to be happening to me, what sort of things ought to be happening to my loved ones. And do I just want to preserve life and miss the point entirely? Or can I embrace those changes, embrace those transitions, understand that any kind of thing could happen at any moment, and if I'm fully present, if I'm living into it, that's when life really comes. That's when Jesus brings life and life more abundantly. Amen.